Welcome, everyone, to our mini course, How Adoptees Experience Grief. Thank you for joining us today. We're glad that you're here. I am Coach Sally, who will be guiding you through this course, as well as Coach Sharon. We both are co owners and co founders of Growing Intentional Families Together, along with our two other colleagues, Coach Susan and Coach Gail, that you see here. We are a coaching company of certified coaches who provide skilled support throughout the adoption process, everywhere from pre adoption, like you are here probably, or those who are post adoption parents and families. We bring our personal and our professional experience to this conversation today on grief.
My name is Sharon Butler Obaze, and I am an adoptee. My infant adoption occurred when I was 9 months old. I was the oldest of five siblings who were also adopted. We were all unrelated through DNA and shared a two-parent home. With over 300 children, our parents provided foster care to while we grew up in the home. And I can't help but tell you here, there was a great deal of structure. My parents did the best to exemplify their values that they taught us. They loved us, but adoption carries its own complexities, and today we will try to help you understand the struggles and responsibilities adoptive parents require to facilitate confidence in the child they adopt.
I am Sally Ankerfeld. I've been an adoptive parent for over 26 years. My journey began when my husband and I adopted our son from the Philippines when he was 16 months old. He's now 26. Then we participated in an open adoption here in the United States where our daughter's mother chose us to be her daughter's parents. Our daughter came to us at 6 weeks old. She is now in her early 20s. And finally, we adopted our third child when she had just turned 12. She had an experience in foster care. She is now in her early 30s. So we have had several different experiences that ultimately brought me here to you as someone who cares deeply for those who are preparing to adopt and for current adoptive families. Especially, I have deep concern for the children at the center of it all. I'm happy to be here. We would like to begin by sharing with you this helpful guideline for adoptive parents and anybody in the adoption constellation. It's called the Adoption Attunement Quotient. You will notice that the elements in this list all assist with developing adoption attunement, with helping all of us to be in tune with our children. Today, we will be working to consider grief and loss issues. So that we can have a common understanding, let's define grief and loss. Blogger Jamie Anderson has a wonderful quote about grief. She says, "Grief, I've learned, is really about love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot. Grief is love with no place to go." Consider how grief shows up, even after the death of a pet. I remember when our cat Honey was lost for 2 weeks. This is many years ago now. We all were worried and sad, but especially the kids. We imagined the worst. We wanted to hug our cat again. So imagine the joy when he strolled through the open door. Then, just 2 years ago, suddenly Honey died. Our cat's name is Honey. This was another hard moment. One of the hardest parts of this for our kids, which they told us, was that they were not able to say goodbye, to give their beloved pet of 15 years a last hug. Both of these events are loss. The missing cat and the death of Honey. It brought on grief. And we saw how grief showed up through anxiety, tears, sleepless nights, edgy behavior. For this course, we're talking about how the loss in adoption shows up, how the manifestation of loss is grief, and how grief brings up its own self through the generation in life altering ways.
This image is to illustrate the expression of grief. For some of us, this might be a bit disturbing or perhaps weird, but in a way, that's the purpose of the structure. It helps us to see how uncomfortable the truth is about how grief can leave a person feeling empty, like a shell of themselves, or for children, as if they don't have their identity. It's important to pause for a minute and say that each adoption triad member experiences grief differently.
First, let's take a moment to think about an adoptive parent's grief. This is a biggie for us as adoptive parents, and one that I think we actually sometimes overlook. I would venture to guess that many of you have the situation my husband and I had. We were experiencing infertility. As happy as we were about adopting, we also, especially for me, felt, and I still feel sometimes, sadness over not having the experience of giving birth, not having someone with my DNA, not ever knowing what a baby born from me would look like or act like. I still think of it sometimes. I have worked through much of that, but it's still there. And the grief of not knowing how I would feel about a child born to me.
So, as Sally has mentioned through her own personal experience, that prospective parents and eventually, hopefully, new parents bring grief to the relationship as well. I watched my mother go through a grieving process after miscarriages. I think she had like two failed attempts that I observed as a child. It was difficult for her to transition from her own personal experience of losing a baby to a motherly or parenting experience of guarding and caring for children. Um, it was difficult because her grief didn't stop just because her parenting responsibilities started. As an adoptee, I really didn't completely understand or grasp what was going on completely. I waited until later on in life when I was able to have discussions with her about the feelings she experienced. I sensed it in a way, and it was not an easy experience for either one of us.
We would like to pivot now to address the birth mother's experience with grief. There is a neural pathway that is created while the fetus is in utero. So not only does the fetus receive nourishment from the expectant mother, but the fetus also receives her experiences through hormones. The hormone cortisol often is produced when anybody experiences stress, grief, or loss. Cortisol starts to flow and it is also received then by the fetus. The fetus feels the loss and stress of the expectant mother because the cortisol is signaling the stress. So, can you see how possible relinquishment or fear of removal of an infant or child not only affects the mother, but also the unborn child? The expectant mother grieves, and so the unborn child senses this as well. By the way, birth fathers also have an impact on this. There is science currently developing around this idea that the birth father and their experiences of stress and other factors influence the fetus. So, by now, you are probably noticing that as we have been describing the grief and the experience of the adoptive parents, the first mother and father, and the developing fetus, you can probably see how they all intersect to impact the adoptee and the adoptee's life experience. Now that we have touched on the three aspects of grief that impact the adoptee, we would like you to take a few moments, if you would like, to use your journal and think about what kind of perceptions you have had previous to this conversation and what might now have changed. To assist you with your thoughts, we have placed here some of the myths and facts around grief. Think about the myths that you see here and look at the facts and see if anything has shifted or changed for you throughout this discussion. So, how do children communicate grief? How do you know if a child is grieving? Well, they communicate through their distress, through their physiology, and through their behaviors. And this is different sometimes for different ages of children. So, first, let's take a look at what is behind the behaviors and what's going on in the brain, and then we will break that down and see what that might look like for children of different ages. As you can see here, the limbic system is a term for a set of brain structures that support a variety of functions, including our emotions, our behavior, and our long-term memory. I find it so interesting that grief and loss, especially in children, can really affect the limbic system because their brains, especially the parts that regulate emotion and behavior, are still developing. So they do not always have the words or the memory to express what has happened to them, but their bodies hold the memory. Can you see where we are heading with this? If the body of a tiny infant who still cannot express through words or memory is experiencing the grief, the body will certainly communicate this grief. Even an infant who has experienced such a devastating loss, which is the removal from the one who gave them birth, even an infant still grieves. But there are no words or working memory for the loss. Those of you who may be expecting to adopt a very young child, such as from birth to 3, you may see this grief show up in the body of your child. Your baby may be irritable, fussy, colicky. They may have trouble sleeping, diarrhea, upset stomachs, even skin rashes, or difficulty being calmed. At around 6 months, if they are removed and placed in your home at that age, they can feel, actually, believe it or not, a loss of trust. Where did my caregiver go? This can create huge psychological stress. You might see that little 6-month-old baby rage and protest to the loss of their anchor person. They may regress, withdraw, they may become lethargic, have trouble eating or sleeping. They might be fearful. Now, at this age, if we as parents take the approach of trying to ignore the behavior or punish the child, so basically, if our infant's needs are not met, they may stop crying out. I remember my husband and we were feeling sometimes like we were giving in to our child when we didn't let her cry herself to sleep because this was going against some old conventional wisdom. But we had to make that call and we responded to her needs. A toddler also can have some regression in milestones as a part of their expression of grief. They can be clingy suddenly. They can return to wetting the bed. They might have difficulty sleeping. They can go back to crawling or using baby talk or wanting the bottle or even sucking their thumbs. Infants and toddlers could go the other direction as well, and they can be resistant to touch. They could be hyper alert. They can be stiff and bending backwards. They can even grasp something and not want to let it go or not want to put something down. Or they can be to the point where if you put them down, they will even wake up suddenly from a sound sleep and just want to be held, needing that attention for fear of not having their needs met in the future. It's good to notice also if your toddler or child is being too good, meaning that they can maybe play forever on their own. This could mean that the child has given up or learned that their needs won't be met by another person. Therefore, they don't even try.
Preschoolers are more aware of their surroundings, but still don't have an understanding of why they feel the way they do. The result is seen in their behaviors. They may have experiences with yearning, especially if in a closed adoption or they have not had a chance to meet their first families. They're, they can express this through asking strangers, "Are you my birth parents?" They also experience sadness, depression, become clingy are hyperactive. They may have control issues and may feel responsible for the situation they find themselves in. There can be self blame or phobias at school. The mind can create physical responses such as tummy aches or a sweet tooth. I have had many conversations with adoptees who report digestive issues. My adopted sister and I had examples of this in that she had migraines and I had stomach cramps. We used to tease each other about which was the worst and how we could switch if possible. Additional physical responses might be clumsiness, feeling less self-coordinated, missing and dropping things can be attributed to adoption. We can see things that aren't there. Our minds tend to be hyperactive and work overtime. Looking for some tangible reason on the surface, we use our imagination. Apparent lack of feeling about what's happened. Our physical behavior changes, and you can see your child report to have complaints and her body or body is hurting, accidents that require attention, not eating, overeating, changes in sleeping patterns, and nightmares, night terrors even, insomnia, and fear of being alone at night or bedwetting. Regressive behaviors that can occur in preschoolers can be overly clingy and needy, and have regressed language and development, desire to be held and rocked, suck their thumbs, or be babied. Disorganization can occur through panic and fear and forgetting things, trouble retaining new information, or forgetting normal patterns and routines or rules. And separation anxiety can also trigger uh, this as a transition through this phase of development. Explosive emotions and acting out can result in displacing strong emotions onto someone else. Increased sibling rivalry, appearing hyperactive, impulsive, reactive, irritable, destructive, aggressive, appearing anxious, restlessness, oppositional behavior, and defiant behavior can also be an example of this particular phenomenon in preschoolers.
When children reach the preteen and teen years, many of them are growing out of that magical thinking stage and they're beginning to think abstractly. When this happens, our kids can more fully understand the concept of adoption and permanency. They can understand all of a sudden how life difficulties like poverty, mental illness, or other factors can affect people and impact their ability to function optimally, such as to parent a child. They can start making that connection between life struggles and their first family's struggles, and therefore they start to grasp even better more certain aspects of their own history. This increased awareness can actually bring about a new sense of grief and loss because they're knowing more what was at stake and what happened. Teens can go one way or the other with this, but one option that they often take is to talk less about their adoption. It's good to know this because that does not mean that they aren't thinking about it. In fact, they might be thinking even more about it. They may be starting to get concerned about fairness, like what's fair about adoption? Or they might be also thinking, who gives their child away? You don't give away someone you love. These kinds of questions cause grief to bubble up, and it can look more like adult grief. It can come out in anger, sadness, rebellion, even engaging in behaviors that parents would disapprove of. It can be also suicidal ideation that pops up, risky behaviors like cutting or sexual acting out, even pregnancy to prove love and break a pattern. There can be identity issues, which there are anyway as preteens and teens, but these can be magnified by the grief and loss. And it can often turn to identities that they look for that reject both the adoptive and birth families. These can all be signs of grief and loss.
What does this all have to do with grief? Well, the simple answer is that the separation from first family can express itself throughout development and through adulthood. So, grief is expressed at home and in school. Grief can entail the following overall behaviors in elementary school children: academic problems, wanting to sleep with parents, concentrating, anxiety, behavioral issues, change in play, stomach aches, headaches, forgetfulness, disorganization, or procrastination. They can also express fear of leaving home or trying new things. They can say they're sick a lot and or become hyperactive or have limited isolation experiences. During 6 to 12 years of age or middle school, we need to understand cause and effect. As your child begins to understand that the birth parents were not able to parent them, they may wonder and fear hurting your feelings and becoming hypersensitive to attitudes of family, worried about birth parents and siblings and wondering where they are. They may regress, be angry, irritable, and blame themselves. Secretly, they're wondering, what is wrong with me? Why did they give me away? And it's not helpful to say your mom loved you so much that she gave you away. That may be seen as unjust to the adopted child. Behaviors become more expressive in high school. They have learning problems, they daydream a lot about birth family and family members. They're emotionally withdrawn, lots of questions about birth family and cultural exploration, while expressing anger to create distance and avoid additional loss. It's important to have age relevant, honest conversations with your children. My experience in school was I recall just being a small group, very small group, maybe 5 people of color in our community. My experience was complicated with the adoption relative issues alongside prejudices. There were many situations in which I wondered how my life might be different had I remained with my birth family. My sister and I relied on each other through several attacks on our safety. We were threatened with knives by children that did not want our kind at their school. Grief can be multifaceted for children who are adopted into transracial families. Take time to understand your child's heritage and cultural traditions to demonstrate support for who they are to impact their self awareness. Other signs that your child is experiencing grief issues can appear positive while having an alternative impact on their character. Overly perfect can be a sign of a fear of losing the adopted parent's approval, maybe even a fear of being rejected if one is not good enough. It is a residual effect of the original loss and grief. Be concerned and notice if your child is too good, and I quote, meaning they can play forever on his or her own. This could mean that they have given up or learned that their needs will not be met by another. I am not sure how many of you are familiar with Clifton's strengths, but my number one strength is maximizer. It seemed very important to me at a very young age to gain peer and community approval. I focused on quality and preferred to work with others for the best potential outcome. In the desire to achieve this outcome, it can be easily complicated when I try to assess which outcome was the best by assessing and looking at several outcomes. As with my adopted life, there is no perfection, and I became aware of the need to accept what is rather than what if. With your support and external professional oversight if needed, your child may have an opportunity to take on roadblocks and to overcome them through development. Becoming the best person they can be is possible, and getting help is okay when needed.
At this point, if you want to take some time to reflect in your journals, we invite you to do so. We invite you to think about the parenting strategies that you were thinking of using or maybe are currently using, and how might these strategies slightly change based on what we have discussed today. Now I will be pivoting to parenting. Since we have heard how our children might express their grief, we do want to talk about how we can help our children cope and live with their grief. From the adoptive parent perspective, I can tell you that this is in front of my mind almost every day, even now as my kids are entering and are into adulthood, because I can still see the grieving that they are doing. Sometimes we learn best by learning what not to do. Here we have some main parenting choices that can cause more harm and actually increase the grief that our children have to live with. The first one, and it's a biggie, and most people do know this now at this day and age, it's not telling a child they are adopted. When we don't tell our children their beginnings, oh my, it leads to parents lying, telling falsehoods. It creates secrecy. This leads, of course, to fear and shame, sort of like what don't I know? What aren't they talking about? It can create anxiety and confusion for a child. Most often is the case, too, that many other people know that this child was adopted. So it's the child who's the odd one out. And here it is, their information. Not telling a child they are adopted is very damaging. If adoption is not discussed in general, but specifically about the child, that child does not have the words to express their grief. They simply know that something's not right. And as that child gets older, if the parents do not initiate conversation around adoption and grief, children may be left hanging, which can compound the grief. When we do not talk about grief, we also cannot see as parents as clearly when our children are signaling for us that they are grieving. And we tend to then ignore or minimize behaviors, or we attribute the behaviors to something else and move towards punishment, when in actuality, it very well could be that our children are grieving.
Parents may hold back because of their fear. They don't feel equipped to handle it. They may also feel that they would want to hold on to their own experiences of grief, and discussing these factors might open Pandora's box. Sometimes parents block or minimize discussions because they fear the expression may be a personal rejection of them. This can frustrate the child because the action that is required in this case is to focus on the child and help them overcome their emotions that are not intended to be an analysis of you and your relationship. Avoiding connection or focusing on a child to stay so busy that they don't have time to grieve is not the solution. Speak up and become curious about how the child feels, and demonstrate intentional interest in who they are and how they feel about the things they are interested in doing. Making no effort to connect with the birth family can have a negative impact in the long run. It's easier to become connected to a child through your family values and traditions. Please remember these factors are important in a family, and that a child centric adoption is concerned with the child's needs. Take every effort to connect with the first family for your child's growth and development.
So, what can we do to help our children with their grief? Well, even with infants, we can think sensibly. Children who are coming from other countries, especially, but this could apply to any child anywhere. I think, though, especially of those children who are having a huge cultural change. They're moving to an unfamiliar environment, different smells, different touches, different sounds, different languages for some of our kids. Think about what you remember in your childhood. If I asked you to tell me what you remember about your favorite place, what would you say? Some of us would probably maybe say, well, my grandmother's house. I can tell you what I remember about my grandmother's house. And if I asked you the same thing about what you remember about your favorite place, I'm going to guess you would probably say something similar. My grandmother's house had a certain smell, is what I would tell you. I remember having a blanket also at my grandmother's house. I remember the smell of the cookies that she made and the oatmeal that she'd make for us in the morning. When you think of this, think of your infant as well. Smells are powerful, food is powerful. If you can, with a baby from another country, send a blanket to be with them in that country. So when that you come to them and meet them and bring them home, you will be bringing the blanket, the consistency of the smell. If there's a special food that you can bring back with you that's allowable to travel all the way back here, bring the food with you as well. Even if your child is coming from this country, ask what kinds of food are common in the area where your child was born. Bring the food, bring the smell. Introduce a blanket or other clothes as well. And have your child roll around, so to speak, in that smell where they are currently living. When you bring your baby home, don't change your baby's clothes for several days. Don't wash them either. Slowly introduce new clothing items and new smells. Especially in the first few days, take your time as you do so. As I mentioned, if you have a certain formula that your child has been using, make sure that you buy a lot of that and bring it home with you. I recall our trip to the Philippines. We brought home cans of the formula that our son had used in the Philippines, and we gradually mixed it with American formula. A stuffed animal is another thing that you could bring with you and have them keep until your child remains home, returns home with you. Recording storytelling is another option. If you have access to and availability to bring a recording of yourself to where your child currently is living, if that's allowable, and if they would be so kind as to start playing that for your child, songs maybe that you're singing or words simply that you're using, when your child returns to your home, they will be familiar with your voice on some level. Of course, keeping the same schedule for your child that they had wherever they came from would be very important, and gradually changing it in a very, very slow manner so that that change can be less traumatic for your child as well. These are just some ideas. to help your future child with the grief, because the more familiar things that they have with them in your home, the less they will be grieving a sudden loss of what they once heard and smelled and felt.
Let's talk about how to stay calm and de stress your infant child. It can be harder and stressful during the first early stages because the first 3 months within a newborn's life is harder than any other part. You will be developing a new relationship. It's not easy to cope with the demands of a new baby. Take a moment when you have time to unwind. Speak with a friend, your partner, about how you're feeling. Slow down. Take a moment to close your eyes and recall a pleasant memory. Interact with others when you have a moment. Don't be afraid to ask for help and take time to relax when time allows. Remember, there is no such thing as a perfect parent. Don't use every minute that your baby naps to get everything done on your to do list. Your child can respond with stress factors indicated by their physical cues. When they're overstimulated, they tend to have a lot of hiccuping, yawning, sneezing, frowning, looking away, squirming, frantic behavior, or arms and legs pushing you away. Take the moment to try to de escalate your child and bring them back into the present moment. Let them know that everything is okay and that they are safe. I know you can do this. It just takes time.
We invite you to reach out to our professional coaches. As your personal guide, they can help you walk through the adoption process and help you prepare well for adoptive parenting. And if you are already parenting, your coach can provide personalized support. You can call us at 800 653 9445 or email us at adoptioncoach@giftfamilyservices.com. We look forward to hearing from you. This course was created by Growing Intentional Families Together, LLC. The information provided is not intended as medical, therapeutic, or legal advice. This presentation may not be shared or broadcasted without written permission. Address inquiries to us at adoptioncoach@giftfamilyservices.com. Happy parenting.